The idea that dependency is always a bad thing. We have to withdraw services, we have to make sure that we're weaning them off because we don't want people to be dependent. We don't want people to be dependent on the council. Sure, I can understand that. But the notion of managed dependency, as Danielle Turney calls it, is entirely healthy. You know, those of you that have adult children, when you take them to IKEA to buy a cheap frying pan and saucepan kit, you don't worry that you're creating dependency, you're setting them up so they can cook. That's entirely natural and reasonable. So thinking a bit more critically about the notion of dependency and what we mean by it. And of course, as you folks know better than anyone, with older children, with young people, with young adults, we have to think not in the rescue mindset, but about promoting resilience, working in a way which skills and equips these young people so that when we withdraw from their lives, we leave a legacy and not a gap. And that means that we have to think really carefully about their changing dynamic developmental needs. And we'd argue that there are really powerful moral and economic drivers for a reimagined safeguarding system, which is contextual, transitional and relational. And one thing I want to acknowledge up front is that transitional safeguarding is not a model. Transitional safeguarding is not a blueprint. It's not a thing you can pick off the shelf that's been tested in Minnesota and plonk it into the middle of Camden. It's a way of thinking, and the solutions that local areas devise to become more transitional in their safeguarding are entirely rightly grounded in local knowledge. And if that wasn't enough to convince you, let's talk about brain development. There was a cracking paper by Sawyer and colleagues in The Lancet a couple of years ago, and they looked at brain development and the effects on our behaviour, and they took into account things like affect regulation, sort of managing and understanding feelings, and our social relationships and our executive functioning, how we solve problems and whatnot. And they present us with the idea that adolescence is not in fact best defined as about 11 to about 17, as so many of our services are set up. They suggest that a better definition for adolescence would be about 10 to about 24, and this much more closely aligns to adolescent growth and our popular understandings of this life phase. Now, this is not to infantilise young adults, and I'm sure none of us would want any 23, 24-year-old that we know and value to be called a teenager. But there's something about recognising that the structures we traditionally have in place no longer stand up to scrutiny when compared to the emerging research base. And because we have a system which is predicated on a fairly binary understanding of childhood and adulthood, we have a system where there are gaps. So if you imagine these two planets, the child protection planet, where, I should say globally, we're pretty good at protecting younger children from harming their family. And then we have the adult safeguarding planet, led by the Making Safeguarding Personal agenda, all about rights-based, person-centered notions of safeguarding, where there's language like risk enablement, which feels rather thrilling to those of us who've spent our careers in children's services, whereas in adults, there's much more of a sense of positive risk-taking. Now, these two planets, you could argue, are actually moving further apart, with the policy agenda led by different governmental departments, differences in post-qualifying standards and professional capabilities around that, different agendas from the chief social workers. Now, that's all absolutely grand and proper, but if there is a danger these planets are moving further and further apart, it becomes painfully clear that some groups of our young people are falling through the gaps. And when I say young people, I'm using the United Nations definition, which is 14 to 25. Young people with learning disabilities, or rather particularly young people with learning difficulties, with mental health problems and needs, but not necessarily a formal diagnosis, those young people can be particularly poorly served. And then, of course, and I know this is a topic that Camden colleagues have spent a lot of time thinking around, and have got some really powerful innovations within, young people who are affected by extrafamilial harm and or those involved in the youth justice system. These are our citizens who are falling through the gap because we have a safeguarding system which is holding on to a very binary notion of childhood and adulthood and isn't recognising that developmental, dynamic, fluid process that transition really represents in the human experience. And what does all this mean for actual young people with real voices? Just a few quotes here from young people that I've had the privilege of talking to or working with as we shaped our thinking in this. Max, who was a care experienced young adult, he was chairing a conference with me, and he said to a room full of social workers, he was thanking them. He was taken to care when he was 3 months old. And he was saying, "You did a really good job of keeping me safe. Thanks for that. I was in care all my life. You wrapped me up really tight and bubble wrap. But now I'm 19 and I kind of feel like I can't move my arms." And I think that's really profound. And what Max is kind of challenging us to reflect on there is that we did a great job of protecting him. We didn't do much to prepare him for adulthood. So there's something about how we consider the system goal of our care system is not simply to accommodate. It's not simply to physically protect people until they're 18, 21, 25 in the state court arrangements. It's to prepare them to become healthy, fulfilled, safe, functioning, contributing adults. Kelly is a young woman who is being supported by a sexual exploitation service in the north of the country. And as it happens, in Kelly's local authority, their sexual exploitation hub is hosted by Adult Social Care and works with victim survivors from the age of 14 up. In my view, a very, very good model. And Kelly said to her worker, who passed this on to us, "I couldn't wait to get to 18. I thought once I was an adult, everything would change. Hasn't worked out that way. I wish I was a kid again so they could lock me up." And I find that really poignant because with the best will in the world, if a young adult equates safety with being incarcerated, I'm not sure we've got the safeguarding bit right. And Aisha, a gloriously articulate young woman who has been a real support in shaping our thinking around transitional safeguarding. And Aisha was describing something which really struck me. She talks about her needs. She knows herself very well. She talks about how lonely she gets, and she understands that her care experience is part of what's contributed to her loneliness. Aisha knows that if she was in her 70s, we would understand her loneliness as potentially a safeguarding issue, a well-being issue. Because she's not, she's in her 20s, no one talks about her loneliness as a safeguarding issue. Now, Aisha draws a very clear line between her care experience, her loneliness, and the fact that she is vulnerable to becoming ensnared and involved with men who frankly aren't very good for her or good to her. And then she said, and I think she's absolutely right on this, "But unless you're worried about my child, I won't hear from you lot again." She meant children's services. And she's got us bang to rights, of course. We spent huge amounts of time in her childhood worrying about the risks she faced, so much so that we took her into care. She's now telling us what risk she faces and how it's affecting her wider safety and indeed her child's safety. And we now only conceptualise her as being a risk to her child. So really think about how those voices, as well as the research literature, can shape our thinking. Well, we might want to be redesigning our system in this kind of way. This is a loose framework. We would want this new system to be evidence-informed. But being evidence-informed doesn't mean we've read an article. Being evidence-informed is kind of a mindset. It's about recognising that whatever you did, no matter how long you've done it for, when new evidence emerges, you have to be open to that learning. You have to be brave enough to shift your practice, to shift your leadership in accordance with new information. Sometimes that means we have to accept that what we've been doing wasn't right, however intuitive or affirming that practice might have been to us. These kind of three pillars or columns within this system, we'd argue this system should be contextual, or you could say ecological, absolutely recognising Carleen Furman's fabulous work in this field and thinking about how do we draw on everything that Carleen and her team have shown us around safeguarding being about creating safe places, spaces and contexts for young people, not this individualised notion of safety. It means we have to shift our assessment and our intervention and our review, and it means we have to take a really demonstrably expansive, inclusive, place-based approach. If you've shut lots of your youth provision, and I know in Camden you fought hard not to lose so much youth provision in some parts of the country, but you will have lost some. McDonald's and other fast food outlets often still provide free Wi-Fi. That's where your kids are. So we need fast food groups around our safeguarding table. They're part of our subgroup. They're part of the system. Secondly, this system would be transitional or developmental. It would take a developmental perspective, recognising everything we know about the adolescent and early adulthood development phase, our brain development, our social development. It would allow a system whereby practitioners can exercise nuanced judgement, being fluid over time. You know, Martin might be 19, but Martin might need much more protection, and we might have to gently ratchet up the degree of participation and agency that we can offer him. Whereas hopefully people might think, well, actually Des is able to demonstrate a high degree of autonomy and agency, and we need to ratchet down the degree to which we're overly prescribing the protective measures she requires. So we're kind of easing in a flexibility tailored around the individual's needs. And this requires us to align our systems better, of course. And thirdly, this system be relational. And I know I'm on safe territory talking to Camden about this. A person-centred approach to safeguarding rather than a process-driven approach, where relationships are not just the vehicle for good quality intervention, they are the intervention in and of itself in many instances. It requires practitioners across all professional groups to be reflective, to be self-aware, to be emotionally literate, to adopt a capacity building approach, so we're leaving a legacy, not a gap. And of course, it demands that we are trauma attuned. We understand that the past affects the present, affects the future, and that trauma can manifest itself in a variety of different ways. And I suppose I would say from a less academic perspective, a bit more prosaic here. If you think of a person you love dearly in your life, and you imagine someone digging around in their trauma, asking them some very painful questions, asking them to revisit difficult parts of their experiences, how much training would you want that person to have had? And how much training are you offering your staff? Because if there's a mismatch, there's a problem. Running all the way through this system, we need to have a much, much sharper focus on equalities, diversity and inclusion. I don't use the F word very often when I'm talking to local authorities because I think you're all doing marvellous things under difficult circumstances, but I will use it now. We have failed to engage effectively in notions of equalities, diversity and inclusion, particularly in our work with teenagers and young adults, especially those affected by extrafamilial harm. It is not acceptable or defensible that young people with learning disabilities and difficulties are overrepresented as both victims and instigators of criminal and sexual exploitation. It is not acceptable that young men consistently over many, many decades have had their sexual harm needs overlooked, have been under-identified as victims of sexual harm. Not least, of course, because an awful lot of our checklists for CSE are deeply gendered. And it is not acceptable that we have the levels of racial disproportionality within our youth justice system. We have to think really long and hard about what kind of society we're trying to create here. And the time is now. If ever there was a moment to be bold and radical and completely unlearn some of the injustices that have become baked into our system, it's this year. And running all the way through it like a stick of rock, this system will be participative. Not just the wishes and feelings stuff in our individual practice work, but having young people and young adults actively engage in informing service design, system design, service evaluation, co-delivery of support, being treated as equal partners in the wider system challenge, not passive recipients of professional intervention. I want to focus a little bit on the nuts and bolts of practice, again, because I know you guys are really good at this in Camden. If we're going to think about working with this age group in a way which is absolutely resilience oriented, relationships are the key to that. Relationships are paramount to promoting resilience. I will briefly note that resilience is not an innate character trait. It's not fairy dust we can sprinkle on a person, and it's definitely not code for cuts, nor is it a substitute for support. I like the Pooley and Cohen definition of resilience, where they define it as using your internal and external resources to rebound from adversity. So it's what you've got in you and what you've got around you. One of the things that's really strongly associated with resilience is self-efficacy. So self-esteem is, knowing your worth, thinking you're a bit good. Self-efficacy is knowing you have a little bit of mastery or control, that you're in charge in some way of your life. And the way we work with young people and young adults can either serve to enhance their self-efficacy or to inadvertently undermine it. When we do 2 people and we do 4 people, we can inadvertently undermine their self-efficacy. So there's a real task here for practitioners across all agencies, and indeed those who manage and supervise and support them, to think about how we can integrate protective practice with participative practice, because we're not really doing one without the other, we might argue. And when we deny young people self-efficacy, something really, really quite scary happens. These 2 quotes here are from the first one there from some work that Helen Beckett and Camille Warrington did, where they talked to young people about their experience of the justice process, particularly those who've experienced sexual exploitation. And it's full of really heart-rending quotes, like young people saying, the abuse was bad, the trial was worse. And we should remember that almost invariably, young people go to trial, when they go to trial, over the age of 18. So often they're experiencing a particularly traumatic part of their life, and because we haven't got a transitional approach, they might be doing that with very, very little support. This young person says, I was basically a puppet. When they wanted me, I had to do it, and when they didn't want me, I heard nothing. This sense of being picked up and dropped, being a pawn in a game. Not what we intended, but it can be their experience. And then Warrington, in her chapter in the Melrose and Pierce book, this quote really made me think. Workers expect you to tell them everything about your lives, but they tell you nothing about theirs. That's how the men work too. They find out everything about you, they don't even tell you their real name. If we don't really carefully think about integrating participative and protective practice with these teenagers, with these young adults, there is a danger that we are replicating or mirroring the very same coercive, controlling context that we went in to rescue them from. And that should stop us in our tracks, colleagues. What might it mean, for example, to take those 6 key principles as set out in the Care Act that govern all of our work with adults and critically interrogate whether they could apply to our work with teenagers? The notion of empowerment and people being worked with, not done to, absolutely core to work with adults. I wonder what we might import. I wonder what we might bring down to our work with children. Prevention, of course, protection, all familiar words, but proportionality. I don't think we use words like proportionality in our work to safeguard children and young people. Maybe we need to. So there are some frameworks in existence that could be adapted and reflected on to inform our service design. But when I say service design, really I mean system design. And not everything that is about a person's safety and well-being automatically means safeguarding with a capital S. It may be no business of statutory agencies to intervene in some people's lives. What we're looking for here is a whole place offer, not a discrete service. As soon as you use language like service or transition service, you're into stuff like caseloads and throughput and referral criteria, and horrible language like stock and flow starts to creep in. We want a whole place, whole person offer, where the community is part of that system, because communities stick around. About 60% of us still live within 20 miles as adults of where we did when we were 14. Networks matter. So thinking about universal services and the role they play, not just as referring in, but about creating safe spaces, enabling healing, enabling rehabilitation. But also thinking about Camden as a human learning system, to steal Toby Lowe's word. It's about investing in the capacity to learn and adapt and collaborate and make mistakes together and be bold together. And that being really the name of the game.